Herzlich willkommen bei unserem Webinar. Ich freue mich, dass wir so viele Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer heute begrüßen dürfen. Ich möchte mich kurz vorstellen. Mein Name ist Irene Lack-Hageneder. Ich bin die Leiterin des Außenwirtschaftscenter Washington und ich darf Sie heute durch die kommende Stunde und unser Webinar führen. Ehe wir zum Thema kommen, ein paar administrative Hinweise. Sie kennen das jetzt sicher schon alle als geübte Webinarteilnehmer. Bitte alle Mikros stumm lassen, Kameras aus. Sie bekommen ein paar Tage nach unserem Webinar ein E-Mail mit einem Link zur Aufzeichnung des Webinars. Also dieses Webinar heute wird aufgezeichnet und Sie bekommen auch einen Link zur Präsentation. Also das bekommen Sie alles automatisch zugeschickt. Und ich würde Sie bitten, Sie können jederzeit während dem Webinar jetzt Fragen stellen. Bitte diese schriftlich stellen in der Fragenfunktion und wir werden ganz am Ende nach den beiden Präsentationen alle Fragen gesammelt dann durchgehen an die jeweiligen Speaker. Ich werde jetzt kurz eine kleine Intro auf Deutsch machen, aber die beiden Speaker sprechen dann auf Englisch. Das heißt, auch ich werde jetzt dann auf Englisch wechseln. Jetzt gehen wir dann gleich in Medias Res. Worüber sprechen wir denn heute? Bidens Billion-Dollar-Plan heißt das Webinar. Manche nennen es hier eine Jahrhundertchance und ein Window of Opportunity, wo eine ganz besondere Gemengelage hier zusammenkommt. Das ist die Kombination aus Covid-Krise, damit einhergehende hohe Arbeitslosigkeit und Wirtschaftskrise und einem Präsidenten wie Joe Biden mit diesen Prioritäten, die er hat in seiner Politik. Und die führen jetzt zu dieser Situation, wo riesige Investitionssummen der öffentlichen Hand jetzt hier in den Markt fließen. Das ist wirklich eine ganz besondere Situation, weil in den USA normalerweise die Einmischung der öffentlichen Hand in den Markt gar nicht so sehr gewünscht ist. Aber ganz konkret möchte ich jetzt hier drei sogenannte Plans hervorheben, auf die unser Sprecher dann später auch im Detail eingeht. Einmal den American Rescue Plan, das ist dieser Plan, der typisch die Covid-Hilfemaßnahmen enthalten hat. Das sind diese unmittelbaren Hilfsmaßnahmen in Reaktion auf die Covid-Krise. Der wurde bereits beschlossen und wie gesagt Details dazu von Al Gordon. Dann gibt es noch das sogenannte Infrastrukturpaket. Dazu gehört der American Jobs Plan und der American Families Plan. Diese beiden wurden noch nicht beschlossen. Das heißt, den genauen Inhalt und die genauen Summen, die können wir Ihnen jetzt im Detail noch nicht sagen, aber wir können Ihnen schon eine gewisse Richtung geben. Vorab möchte ich da auch noch sagen, ganz wichtig ist, weil das auch Infrastrukturpaket heißt. Präsident Biden hat hier einen sehr weiten Infrastrukturbegriff und unterteilen kann man die in zwei Bereiche, die sogenannte Human Infrastructure und die Hard Infrastructure. Human Infrastructure, das wird hauptsächlich über den Families Plan abgedeckt und das sind die Ausgaben für Bildung, Kinderbetreuung, Krankengeld, Karenzgeld. Das ist alles etwas Revolutionäres und Neues eigentlich in den USA. Dann zweitens diese sogenannte Hard Infrastructure, die hauptsächlich über den American Jobs Plan so ein bisschen abgedeckt wird. Das sind die tatsächlichen Infrastrukturprojekte im engeren Sinne, also Bahn, Straßen, Brücken, Tunnels. Biden hat ein Paket von über 2 Billionen Dollar vorgelegt und wie ich gesagt habe, das ist alles noch nicht beschlossen. Derzeit ist so ein bisschen ein basarartiges Verhandeln im Gange zwischen den Republikanern und den Demokraten. Biden hat eben eine gewisse Summe vorgelegt. Die Republikaner haben dann einen Gegenvorschlag gemacht in der Höhe von ein bisschen mehr als 900 Milliarden Dollar. Dann hat Biden wieder sein erstes Paket ein bisschen reduziert. Also das ist jetzt gerade hochaktuell, diese Verhandlung. Das heißt, man wird sehen, was da dabei rauskommt. Aber wie gesagt, Ziel dieses Webinars war es wirklich, wir können jetzt natürlich noch nicht die einzelnen konkreten Projekte vorstellen, aber was wir mal machen wollten, was mein Ziel ist, hier ein bisschen Bewusstseinsbildung zu schaffen, dieses Awareness Rising bei Ihnen, bei den österreichischen Unternehmen, damit Sie sehen, was ist hier auf dem Weg, was kommt hier und dass Sie sich vielleicht auch rechtzeitig vorbereiten können, weil Sie wissen ja selber, wenn dann ein Projekt ausgeschrieben ist, dann ist es oft schon ein bisschen spät, um sich vorzubereiten. Und bevor ich jetzt an meinen ersten Sprecher übergebe, der das alles im Detail vorstellt, switche ich jetzt auf Englisch. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Al Gordon. Al Gordon, he founded NSI National Strategies in 1995, and he serves as its CEO. Now, NSI is a US state and local government consulting firm which provides support to organizations which want to enter or grow in the US market, so companies like you. And prior to that, Al also worked for the New York State Governor Mario Cuomo, so he has also experience from the other side. So actually, I am so glad to have Al with us, because I heard him speak at another webinar, and I was, from the beginning on, I thought, oh, he is the one, he's the speaker that I would really like to have for a webinar to speak to Austrian companies, because he will not only inform you about upcoming opportunities in the US market, but he can also provide you with really useful tips and tricks for working with the US public sector, as this is his job. So thank you so much, Al, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you for inviting me, and thanks to Advantage Austria for organizing such a timely event for Austrian companies. This is an incredibly exciting time to be focused on the public sector in the United States. And what I'm going to try to do is give you some background onto why it's an exciting time. So I'm going to start with an overview of the US state and local government market. I apologize for those of you who are very aware of the market. I'm going to go through some of the federal actions that have been taken to date in response to the pandemic, and then the potential future federal actions, which, as Irene mentioned, will be focused on infrastructure, and then the immediate state and local government needs, as well as 11 recommendations for success in selling to the public sector. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to start with the overview of the state and local government market. Next slide, please. The one thing that's important about the state and local government market is that it's a lot larger than people think. $3.25 trillion of annual spend. Next slide, please. But what makes it very difficult sometimes is that it's extremely fragmented. It has 50 states, almost 20,000 cities, 3,000 counties, and all these special districts, school districts, etc. So a very highly fragmented market across the United States. Next slide, please. Let me just go through a couple of general broad points about the state and local government market that are very important to keep in mind. The first is that they cannot run a budget deficit. This is unlike the federal government, which runs significant budget deficits. Number two is that state and local governments receive their revenue from taxes. Local governments rely on property taxes, while state governments rely primarily on sales and income taxes for revenue. So in a time where the economy is not doing very well, it is state governments that have a less stable revenue base. The third point, which is very important today, and it's going to be a theme throughout my presentation, is that state and local governments play a very significant role in implementing federal policy. And the federal government sends a lot of money to states and local governments to implement that policy. And so by following the money many times, you can find really strong opportunities for sales. Next slide, please. As I said before, the market is very fragmented, but the market is also very political, much more so than the federal government market. In the state and local government market, you will have interaction with elected officials and high-level staff people, which is not the case in the federal government market. In state and local government, 65% of spending is in 4 categories: education, health and human services, law enforcement and public safety, and transportation. So those are your 4 major areas of spending. One big point in the state and local government market is that a lot of state and local governments are using what we call cooperative purchasing. Cooperative purchasing is where a state or local government entity does not need to do a procurement itself. It can buy from a company based on a national or regional cooperative purchasing agreement, and I can certainly go into that in more detail. In addition, a lot of states have their own statewide contracts, which companies need to get on in order to sell to that state. So there are a lot more flexible ways of companies being able to do procurements with state and local governments. And then lastly, which has really been important in the last 15 months, is that states regulate healthcare within their own states and have great latitude in how to do that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, the federal government's been very active in response to COVID-19. The first thing was that back in March 13th, 2020, President declared the COVID-19 as an emergency for all states. This is called the Stafford Act. What that enabled is that FEMA, which is a federal agency, was able to pick up the expenses of state and local governments across the country for all costs related to dealing with the pandemic. Next slide, please. In addition to the Stafford Act, there's now been 5 major federal actions in response to the pandemic. I'm going to focus a lot on the 5th one, the American Rescue Plan, which Irene mentioned, which was just enacted in March. But you can see that there's been a significant amount of dollars that have been sent by the federal government to state and local governments, mostly in 2020, to deal directly with the pandemic. Next slide, please. What's interesting is that of the $5.9 trillion which has been allocated by the federal government to deal with the pandemic, $2.1 trillion of those have not been obligated or spent yet. So that's a significant amount of money that's still available to be spent. Next slide, please. Now, what's important to note is that throughout 2020, all state and local government assistance was for specific purposes related to the pandemic. So they were very specific needs, whether it was testing, ultimately vaccines, all kinds of public safety, et cetera. And all the dollars that were sent to state and local government during fiscal year 2020 was just for that direct COVID response and relief. Next slide, please. In late 2020, phase four, after the election in the United States was passed, and this is being spent in 2021, but again, the dollars in this $900 billion package were for very specific funding for state and local governments. You could see for K-12 schools, for state highways, to purchase vaccines, to support testing. So again, the money was not discretionary. That all changed with the American Rescue Plan. Next slide, please. So the American Rescue Plan includes $350 billion. Yes, that's $350 billion in direct funding for state and local governments. And what's great about the American Rescue Plan for state and local governments is there's really no strings attached in how they can use this $350 billion. Of the $350 billion, $195.3 billion will go to states. Every state will receive at least $1 million, even the smallest state, and $169 billion of the 195 will be distributed to the states based on their share of unemployed workers during the 4th quarter of 2020. The local government money, which is $130.2 billion, is going to be split equally, $65.1 billion going to cities and $65.1 billion going to counties. The counties, they get their money directly, and each county receives the money based on its share of the United States population. And counties have started to receive their allocations already. The city's allocation is divided into formulas based on the size of the city. So if a city has over 50,000 in population, they're going to receive their share of the money directly, and it's going to be through the Community Development Block Grant Program formula. If the city has a population of under 50,000, that aid is going to go to a state, and then the state is going to distribute it to the smaller cities, and the smaller cities is going to get the money based on the percentage of the state's population in that city. In addition, just noting that tribal governments receiving $20 billion and the US territories are receiving $4.5 billion. So a significant amount of money. Next slide, please. What's most important about this is that the use of these money, $350 billion, is limited is limited to 4 areas. Now, one you can understand. That's response to COVID-19, and that's going to be all kinds of expenses related to COVID-19. 2, there was a push to allow for premium pay for essential workers. And you'll see below, there's a cap of up to $13 per hour and $25,000 per employee. But here's the two key provisions, number 3 and 4. Number 3, provision of government services because of a reduction in revenue. That means that state and local governments can use the money for pretty much anything. And then 4, if your company is involved in water or wastewater, sewer, or broadband, there were specific mentions of those 3 sectors in the bill, in the American Rescue Plan. So it's very important to recognize that these dollars can be used for a lot of discretionary purposes, and they all must be spent by December 31st, 2024. Next slide, please. One important note is that the $350 billion to state and local governments is in addition to money that went for specific purposes related to COVID-19. So there's separate money in addition to the $350 billion, vaccine distribution, for contact tracing, for personal protective gear, for community health centers, for schools to reopen safely, to colleges and universities, to airlines and airports, to transit agencies. So all of this money that you see on this slide is in addition to the $350 billion, which shows you exactly the discretion that state and local governments have, because other dollars are being allocated to some of these core needs related to COVID-19. Next slide, please. Just wanted to give you an example of the impact on specific states, counties, and cities. So taking the state of California is receiving $26 billion in direct fiscal relief. $16 billion is going to local governments in California, $20 billion to the education system in California. Huge numbers. If you look down at New York City, $6 billion in New York City and $12 billion to the education system in New York City. These numbers are unparalleled. They've never, state and local governments have never received this type of aid, the size of it, and also the discretionary use of it in the past. Next slide, please. Now, you think that's all, the 350, it's not. In the fall, there's expected to be a large infrastructure package. Now, the infrastructure package, as Irene mentioned, there is a little bit of a debate going on right now in the government between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats, led by the Biden administration, are defining infrastructure as not only traditional infrastructure related to roads and bridges and highways and transit, but also social infrastructure related to housing and in-home care for older Americans and the disabled. And so this fall, the Biden administration has proposed an infrastructure package which will likely be close to $2 trillion. These 8 areas on this slide is what the Biden administration is prioritizing in that infrastructure package. So 1, more money for broadband. So you already saw that broadband was included in the American Rescue Package. So there's going to be additional funds in whatever infrastructure package. 2, drinking water, again, building on the inclusion of sewer and water as approved expenses in the American Rescue Plan. 3, clean energy. The last 4 years in the Trump administration were not really that much of an investment in. The Biden administration is looking to pick that up significantly. This would include solar and wind and grid modernization, battery storage, big focus on electric vehicles and charging stations. 4 is healthcare. There's definitely going to be a commitment to try to build the healthcare system in the United States, particularly the public healthcare system, which was seen as struggling quite a bit during COVID-19. 5 would be transportation, which is traditionally in infrastructure packages, roads and bridges and public transit. 6 is affordable housing, which is, again, part of this social infrastructure investment. 7 is manufacturing. There's going to be a big push in US-based manufacturing, which will include worker training, workforce development training, but there'll be a big push for international companies to create manufacturing sites in the United States with significant incentives to do so. And then finally, 8, in-home care funding for older Americans and the disabled. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this package is divided into 2 plans, the American Families Plan and the American Jobs Plan. The American Families Plan is that social infrastructure part of the infrastructure plan by the Biden administration. So this is going to have money for education and child care and expansion of the Affordable Care Act and nutrition for single parents and children. So all kinds of social infrastructure. Whereas the American Jobs Plan is going to have the traditional money for the infrastructure of transportation, water, energy, etc. So both plans going down the path for the Biden administration, a little bit of a division in Congress where the Republicans want to focus only on the American Jobs Plan, not as much the American Families Plan. We can go into more on that later. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I know you'll receive this. These are the key spending areas for the American Jobs Plan, and you can see the components within transportation and the components between building and utilities related to that spending. Next slide, please. So where does this leave the state and local government market sitting here with $350 billion hitting the market from the federal government now through the American Rescue Plan, and additional dollars coming later this year through the infrastructure package. So what I've tried to do here in the next couple of slides is just give you a little bit of a sense of the trends and implications of these dollars for various sectors in the state and local government market. So first, technology. The United States state and local government market has not been as invested in digital infrastructure as is the case in Europe and most of the rest of the world. And so there's going to be significant dollars to focus on digital infrastructure, as well as moving government services to the cloud. And then obviously broadband is going to be significant because that's already been pointed out as a key component of the American Rescue Plan. In terms of operations and maintenance, I think the biggest thing is this digital infrastructure, hiring and training digitally savvy workforce, and investing in citizen connectivity. More and more government services in the United States are moving online, and state and local governments are trying to provide a more positive online experience for citizens. I put cannabis down here because for those of you not in the United States, there is a big move in the state government market to legalize cannabis. 36 states now allow the medical use of cannabis, and 15 states it's fully legal recreationally for adults. Next slide, please. Construction, there's going to be a huge amount of construction, water, wastewater, electric grid, bridges, roads, highways. The infrastructure package is really being enacted to stimulate construction. In education, most of the focus today is getting students back into schools in a safe environment, but there's going to be continued investment in distance learning platforms, devices, and connectivity. Distance learning is an area where there was not significant investment pre-COVID, and now there is significant investment by school districts and higher education across the country. The Biden administration has a huge focus on social services. That's why you have the whole social infrastructure package. That's going to be a key component of the infrastructure package. This relates to nutrition and affordable housing, childcare. Childcare is going to be a big focus the rest of this year, and food assistance. Workforce development is going to receive significant investment regarding training workers, particularly for manufacturing jobs. There's definitely a movement to strengthen the United States supply chain because of some of the issues during the last 15 months. In public safety, the biggest investment coming up is going to be in cybersecurity. You could see that state and local governments are under a lot of threats in terms of their safety and cybersecurity. I think lately we've seen several 100% increase in budgets within state and local governments. Slide, please. Transportation, there's been obviously, as everybody knows, a lot less transportation around the country. So the focus is on getting public transit agencies and airports back on their feet. The infrastructure package is going to lead to a lot of road, bridge, railway, airport, and port projects. But the other interesting point of the whole infrastructure bill is billions of dollars to support electric vehicles. This includes charging stations and the vehicles themselves. Energy and environment is going to be a big focus: renewable energy, battery storage, resiliency. There's also a lot of focus now on air quality and reducing emissions. Water, you saw water in the American Rescue Plan. Drinking water and wastewater infrastructure projects there's significant funding for investment. And then finally in healthcare, there's going to be a significant investment in PPE, but there's going to be support for community health centers and hospitals to build up the public health system, and also a lot of investment in telehealth, which really took off in the United States during COVID and will continue to do so after COVID. Next slide, please. So I'm going to try to give you a couple of recommendations for how do you achieve success in the government market in the United States. To me, recommendation one is the most important. Without it, you can't achieve success. And recommendation one is making sure you build a list of good targets that fit the criteria of a good sales target for the company. You must build that target. A lot of international companies come in the United States, and in a fragmented market with 20,000 cities and 3,000 counties, they're not focused enough on what's the criteria of a good target and building a list of good targets. Stay focused. Number two, recommendation two, next slide, please. So obviously, building a list of targets is important, but then once you have your list, you must learn about your targeted customers' needs and processes. What's driving their current and future projects? Is it budget? Is it a policy? Is it an initiative, a certain initiative? Is it a technology? If you don't know your needs, this is 101 in sales. If you don't know your customers' needs, it's going to be tough to figure out how to position yourself for a successful sale. At the same time, you need to know what procurement process they like to utilize. Next slide, please. Recommendation three, you have to find your niche in the market. Are you a prime contractor, a subcontractor? Do you need a partner? Would it be a national partner or a local partner? Is there an integrator that you need to involve in terms of making your sale? And do you need to start with some kind of a pilot project? So always figuring out the best route for your procurement. Next slide, please. Partnerships are critical in the United States government market. You have to select them based on their ability to perform, their reputation, their local presence, and how they can help you win. But also the last point here, very important, there are preferences in state and local government for small and disadvantaged businesses. You need to be aware of that as you enter your targeted state and local government markets. Next slide, please. Government doesn't like to take risks. In the United States, there's always the saying that state and local government always feels safe buying from IBM because they can't get in trouble if they do so. So in that kind of environment, you need to prove yourself. You need to validate your offering. Could be a proof of concept, could be case studies, could be public sector references from the United States or abroad, but it's very important for you to distinguish your product, your service, your technology, and make sure you're validating that offering. Next slide, please. Marketing materials tailored for government market. This is critical because a lot of companies go into government and they use private sector marketing materials that talk about profits and companies. This is for the government market, and you need to have a marketing material that's tailored for the government market, and so that the person you're meeting with understands that you know what the government market is and what they could be looking for. And this is a very important, a lot of companies make this mistake, and it's an easy one to correct, but an important one to make sure you don't make that mistake. Next slide, please. First meeting with government decision makers, to me, is the most important one. When I was in government, a lot of companies I sensed came into the first meeting with me thinking that they were going to raise a lot of ideas and figure out what I responded to, and then the second meeting would dig into those prioritized area for me. That's not the case. Usually most government decision makers make a decision within the first 15 to 20 minutes, whether what you have is something they're interested in continuing the discussion about. And so that first meeting, you must be focused. It goes back to picking the right targets and being prepared and understanding their needs. And then in their first meeting, making sure you articulate that and how you can meet their needs. Very important. The first meeting is sometimes your best and sometimes your only chance to be successful. Next slide, please. Strategic plans are really important when selling. If you've already pre-qualified and prioritized a sales target, now the next thing you need to do is sit down and really think about how are you going to be successful? What steps do you need to take to be successful there? This is where I always say teaming up with some kind of a local consulting service on the ground in that particular geographic market could be very important because they might have strong procurement experience and relationships with the decision makers. But without a plan, it's really difficult to achieve success. Next slide, please. Manage your expectations. Government sales in the United States, as anywhere, it could be very long. There are delays. There are a lot of times when you don't get communications back, you don't get feedback. And so you really need to keep your expectations managed throughout the entire process and make sure that you're touching base with your government officials, sending them teasers and things like that. But understand that there will be times that you do not hear back from them, and that does not mean that your process is over or that you're unsuccessful. Next slide, please. Talk to the right people at the right time. We have at NSI a 7 contact rule. 7 contact rule means you should be in contact with the right decision makers in a sales target at least 7 times before a procurement is held. If you're not, that means you're not talking to them enough. And so that's a very important rule. But also remember that a certain point in procurement in the United States is a blackout period where you cannot talk to them again. And so make sure you have those conversations early in the process. Next slide, please. And then finally, understand the proper procurement procedures. They're complex. There could be requests for proposals, requests for information, requests for qualifications. Whatever they choose to do, you must follow it to the T. Penalties for non-compliance are severe. Usually you're kicked out of the procurement. So make sure that you follow it and you understand it and you ask questions of the right person. There's usually one person that's designated as a contact for a procurement. Make sure you ask the questions of that right person. Thank you, Irene. I think it's back to you.
Thank you so much, Al. That was really, really interesting, and I'm sure our participants feel the same. I didn't promise too much. Now, we will come back to you with any questions at the end of the webinar, but let me now switch to our second topic. Now we talked about all the opportunities, and you received tips and tricks on how to use those opportunities. But we also want to mention one thing that you might have already heard about, and that is the so-called Buy American, and in general, the US domestic preference laws. So Buy American is the most famous or the best known out of those US domestic preference laws. So to explain what this exactly means and whether it might really be a serious obstacle for companies, I have invited another speaker, a legal specialist, which is Mr. Andrew McAllister, and he will just tell us more about it. Before I introduce him in more detail, I want you to know that it's important to also understand the political situation in the US, or let's say the political rhetoric, when you're trying to do business in the US. So President Biden, he called his plan American Jobs Plan. So it is important to know that for him, it's important to invest, so all this public money goes into the market to create jobs in the US. His program is all about Build Back Better. And he has this slogan, the future is made in all of America by all of America's workers. So you can see where the rhetoric is. So politically for Biden, he wants to create jobs in the US. So just keep that in mind when approaching the American market, and use any arguments that you have very wisely to explain how your project or your product might create jobs in the US and how it has value added in the US. Yeah, so I'm sure we're going to hear more about it from Andrew McAllister. Let me just introduce him. He's attorney and member of the Holland and Knights International Trade Group and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act team. His focus areas are export control, sanctions, and domestic preference programs, such as Buy American, and many more areas, but those are probably the most relevant to you at the moment. So prior to working for Holland and Knight, he's also gained some government experience working for the Department of Commerce. So now I would like to hand over to you, Andrew. The floor is yours. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Irene. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the kind introduction, and certainly appreciative of the opportunity here, as well as the opportunity to follow Al's excellent presentation. So I think that works well to sort of marry up what we're going to talk about here. Next slide, please. Let's see if I can. Great. And so starting out, I'm going to take sort of a broader view, which is the US government over the last, call it 100 years, they've rolled out a number of domestic preference laws. As Irene mentioned, probably the most famous is the Buy American Act. That goes back to 1933. And then there's some other acts that have also been rolled out over the years. The general motive behind these laws, of course, is to support US manufacturing, to support US jobs, and to support US made goods. And so, again, if you don't remember anything else, right, I think this slide is really the most important, which is, right, there are a number of different laws and requirements out there. It depends on the particular government agency that you're working with, the particular domestic preference clause that's included in the legislation, the regulations. And so these rules all get at that sort of core issue of, hey, as the US government, we want to make sure that we're giving preference to our local industries. But the way in which they apply it, the different rules that apply can be different. So it's important, and I think this goes with some of Al's comments, when you're building your target, when you're understanding their processes, you're also understanding what domestic preference laws may apply, right? And this is, of course, particularly important for foreign companies, in which sometimes compliance with these laws can be quite challenging, sometimes requires partnering with a US company, may require opening a US subsidiary to perform certain manufacturing functions in the US. So the sooner you understand these restrictions and regulations, the better off you'll be. I think I'm controlling it perfect. And so, as I said, there's a number of different laws out there. I think I skipped past, right? Buy America Trade Agreements Act. This one applies mainly to broad US government procurements. And so the Buy America Act generally has two requirements, right? The good must be manufactured in the US, and then either the cost of components exceeds this 55% of all components, or the item is a commercially available off-the-shelf item. And so just to dig into that for a moment, right? Manufactured in the US, well, what does that mean? If I ship 4 components to my US worker, my sole US worker who's got an office, you know, in an apartment building, he gets the 4 components. He gets his screwdriver out of the drawer. He screws together the 4 components and then says, okay, I'm ready to deliver it to the US government, right? That's probably not going to be enough to meet that manufactured in the US requirement, right? There's going to need to be additional manufacturing, additional steps, right? Did the facility receive it? They had to integrate the electrical wiring. They had to build it together. It took 3 days, etc. And so that just gives you a sense of, okay, in these instances where we have to demonstrate that something's manufactured in the US, real activities need to be performed. And so again, the Buy America Act is very restrictive. It's about US manufacturing, US components. However, in many procurements, you have the capability under the Trade Agreements Law, Trade Agreements Act, to broaden the ability to use foreign manufactured items. And so in those types of procurements, there's a group of countries called qualifying countries. And in fact, Austria is one of those qualifying countries. So in instances where you're able to use the Trade Agreements Act, certainly that's going to open things up significantly for an Austrian company. And so again, understanding the requirements, understanding what needs to be done. Just quickly going through, this is the US Department of Transportation's version. So this applies to, transit agencies, transit projects, and then there are other Department of Transportation agencies, Federal Highway Administration. And so these are actually more restrictive than the Buy American Act. And you'll notice that this is Buy America without an N at the end of America. So it's a different set of laws. And again, I don't want to go too deep into the requirements. These are mainly meant for you to sort of sift through after my presentation. But again, this one does not allow you to use qualifying countries or non-US countries. And so it's a much stricter standard here, right? You can't use Austrian manufacturing and consider it to be compliant, right? This is about steel, and then there's a difference between steel and iron end products versus other manufactured products. As you might suspect, the rules on steel and iron end products are more difficult to satisfy, right? Again, the idea is, well, the American steel companies have been fighting for decades to make sure their steel is being utilized. So the laws reflect that. The Berry Amendment specialty metals restriction, I don't really want to spend much time on that. Those are Department of Defense specific domestic preference laws. I think the slide essentially covers the information I wanted to convey. Recent changes, you'll notice that both the Trump administration as well as the Biden administration are emphasizing this Made in America sort of umbrella. And so through an executive order of 2019 and some regulations, this was really the Trump administration that tightened a few areas, as you can see on this slide. Right. Biden administration came in on January 20th. Biden administration issued an executive order on January 25th, the Made in All of America by all of America's workers executive order. So the change in administration in a way did not change the focus on these domestic preference requirements. And so they did a few things, again, to tighten it. They've created this Made in America office to sort of focus the waiver process. There's certain instances where a company may not be able to comply, but nevertheless, they're able to get a waiver, either because, say, the product is unavailable in the US, it can only be grown outside the US. This is just, again, sort of statements that President Biden made at his joint session of Congress. Right, what does this mean for Austrian companies? I think really, as Al did an excellent job of, right, understanding the landscape, getting started on the details, understanding what the particular customer might require, that's paramount. And so, right, in some instances, the American Recovery Plan, Jobs Plan, Families Plan, we know that domestic preference laws are going to be part of it, right? In some instances, we may not know the precise law that applies, but we have a good idea, right? If it's a transit type project, chances are it's going to be the Buy America standard. If it's a broader federal government type procurement, then it's the Buy American Act and the Trade Agreements Act. Well, what we can do now as an Austrian company is start to do our homework, right? Okay, we're a supplier to railroads. Okay, well, we need to start doing our homework to figure out, can we sell a compliant product today, right? So if in 6 months, 9 months, the funds start to get allocated to different agencies, are we going to have a product or service to offer that's compliant at least with the existing laws? And to the extent that we don't, is there something we can do in the interim? Can we partner with an American company to do certain manufacturing steps at the end? in order to complete our product, make it compliant for domestic preference laws, and still put us in a position where we're going to, have an economic benefit. And so I think that's really the lesson here is start doing the analysis now, start to understand the federal and state requirements that apply to the types of areas that you may seek government projects, and figure out if you're not compliant today, how can you make yourself compliant in the short to medium term. And so I think with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. That was as well really, really interesting. And I hope and I think that companies really take a lot of your advice home with them today. So thanks to both of you for being ready to answer also some questions. We received a couple of questions, and let me just start by reading out the first of the questions. So one participant, he asked, he said, I presume that these enormous amounts are being backed by specific projects or master plans, especially when it comes to infrastructure and whether it is for rail, road, water, or energy. Isn't there a list identifying priority projects and its related timeline? So I suppose this question is rather for Al, right?
So the answer to that question differs state by state and municipality by municipality. There are some states that have, and municipalities that have master infrastructure plans that are pretty well laid out and defined, where they'll have a list of priority projects that will be funded. And in many of those cases, that information is public. There's a large degree of transparency around it. Unfortunately, there are some other geographic markets where that is less so, not the case. And so, unfortunately, the answer to that question is it will depend market by market from a geographic perspective.
I remember actually when I heard you speak at this other webinar where I heard you first, you said one sentence that I really found very interesting, that was follow the money. Can you just explain a little more, like how to follow, how can companies follow the money and find out?
So it's very complex. The American Rescue Plan, the $350 billion for state and local government has been given to 50 federal programs. So 50 federal programs receive those dollars and then send those dollars out to the state and local government market. Now, each of those programs is a little different, right? Some of them are focused on technology or infrastructure or water or broadband. And so really what you need to do is track the dollars from the American Rescue Plan to the relevant federal department and program for whatever you are offering, what matches your solutions. And then that that federal program typically has a formula for how they will release those dollars to the state and local government market. So you need to track from the bill to the federal program, the formula that they'll use, and then the formula down to the state and local government market.
All right. Thank you. The second question that we have received was, what about consultancy services related to these projects? Is there a specific budget allocated for such soft services like master plans, bankable feasibility studies, tender preparations, bid evaluation, work as owner's engineer during implementation of specific project? I think that's also rather for Al, this question.
Yes, so most governments, state and local governments, do include those soft costs for the preparation of the plan, for the strategy around the project. So it won't be in 100% of cases, but I would say in maybe 50 to 70% of the cases, those soft costs will be included in whatever money the state or local government receives. Now, the interesting thing to note is that some of the projects that will be funded through the American Rescue Plan might have already gone through those soft costs so that they're more ready to shovel ready, I guess is the term that's been used in the past. But for those that are not shovel ready, those soft costs typically are included.
All right, thank you. Another question is how and where to pre-qualify as a foreign supplier or technical commercial consultant?
So is that to pre-qualify a particular product or?
Like pre-qualify as a foreign supplier.
Oh, okay. So there's a couple of answers to that question. So first of all, there are a number of states that, particularly since COVID started, have what they call procurement sites, where any vendor that wants to do business with the state must register. The registration process is not that complicated, but I would say, upwards of 70–75% of the states have new registration sites that are required for vendors to participate in procurements in those states. So the first thing you need to do is check whether the state that you're focused on has such a site, and only contracts with companies that have signed on to the site and are approved on that site. So that's a key first step. Second step is that there are many states that have contract vehicles. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned early in my presentation that rather than doing individual procurements, a lot of state and local governments are buying services or products or technology off of a contract vehicle that they've set up. If a state has a contract vehicle for what you offer, so it meets your solution, you need to check that contract vehicle and see when it comes up again, when it's opened again, so that you can apply to get onto that contract vehicle.
Yeah, and just one sort of add-on to that, which is, right, in terms of the domestic preference laws, right, it comes up in the context of things like contract vehicles, RFPs, etc. So there's not sort of a pre-qualification process. There's more a, ensuring that whatever you're offering is compliant with whatever applicable standard is identified by the government.
All right, thank you. We have quite a lot of questions, so I will just move on to the next one. So one participant asked, what's the plan for the US on electromobility? Are there some numbers on how many EVs have to be produced in some amount of time?
So the Biden plan includes 500,000 electric charging stations. There's not a specific number of electric vehicles that's included in the plan, although the expansion is significant in terms of the dollars, because there's going to be a lot of incentives given to state and local governments to support the program. But you could see through the 500,000 charging stations that it's going to be a significant number.
All right. Another question, well, one participant writes already, thank you for the extremely insightful presentations. I have two questions. Does AR, American Rescue Plan, and Buy American apply to the IRP market? So for instance, software services based on patented solutions.
Andrew, you want to?
I think that's rather for Andrew. Intellectual property.
Yeah, and so I would say, again, it sort of depends on the particular offering, right? In some instances, there's going to be a clause that you're going to have to certify to that says you're compliant with Buy American, Trade Agreements Act, etc. And so again, becoming as educated as you can be about the particular agencies, whether they're state agencies, whether they're federal agencies, they may have a sort of standard process, a standard set of requirements that have to be satisfied. And so, right, with software, I'm guessing you may be talking about something more broader federal government as opposed to, something that's maybe specific to a transit agency. But yeah, but it could be, of course. But yes, I mean, the same sets of requirements would apply whether it's software or some kind of physical commodity.
All right. Then another question, that's probably again rather for Al. Could you refer to any institutions to follow to be updated on these resource allocations? That's a very interesting question for all participants, I'm sure.
Well, the United States Treasury Department produces a pretty good update regarding American Rescue Plan dollars. And so I think that's an interesting place to look. There's also the National Governors Association, so the NGA, it's called National Governors Association, as well as the U.S. Conference of Mayors is doing a pretty good job tracking some of the American Rescue Plan dollars out to state and local governments as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Just, I don't know, do you wanna give both of us give us one wrap-up statement, because it's already 11:02. So I don't know, like Andrew, maybe could you like wrap up in one sentence and tell the companies, so how big do you think the obstacles of Buy American will really be for Austrian companies? Will the obstacles be bigger or stronger, or will the opportunities be bigger or stronger?
Yeah, no, exactly. And so I would say just one point, and then I'll answer your question, which is, right, remember that these are about the manufacturing activities. They're about manufacturing items. They're about the components. So there's nothing sort of anti-Austrian company about it, right? It's more about, okay, can we figure out a way through it, right? Could we set up a subsidiary in the US to perform manufacturing? Could we partner with a US company to perform manufacturing, right? Again, there's nothing, it's about what's happening to that product. So I would say, as we've discussed here, I mean, the amount of money that's being distributed amongst the government is remarkable. It's amazing in some ways. And so I think most of the domestic preference law requirements, right, you're going to be able to find a way through it, but it's going to be challenging and it's going to take time. And so you need to be prepared for it. You need to be thinking about it from the beginning.
Yeah, that's basically why we're doing this webinar right now, to be sure that people are ready on time and have time to prepare. Al, do you want to probably give us a very short wrap-up statement?
Sure. There's a lot of money in the U.S. government market. The state and local government market's very open to international companies. There's a good history of international companies being successful there, but to access the dollars, you have to be prepared. And being prepared means you need to build your list of targets, pre-qualify sales opportunities, create a strategic plan to pursue it, and use local partners and consultants to guide your efforts. The investment is worth it because if you achieve success, you're going to grow rapidly, but please invest in the resources you need to be successful.
All right. Well, thank you so much to both of you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Al. I think those were really, really excellent presentations and a lot of very useful information for our companies. And that leaves me to thank also the participants. Thank you so much for being with us. As I mentioned, you will receive an email with the link to the presentation and to the video of the webinar. You have on this last slide all our contact details, so we're happy to get back to you in case you have any questions after the webinar. Well, thank you so much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.